Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. The Trump administration's AI action plan and several executive orders emphasize a deregulatory, pro-innovation approach to maintain U.S. global dominance in artificial intelligence. While the U.S. and China are locked in a fierce competition for AI leadership, China's approach to AI is significantly different from that of the U.S. I recently spoke to Rui Ma, a Silicon Valley-based expert and one of my go-to people for all things China tech, about her recent trip to the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai. An American who spent years in China working in finance and tech, Rui Ma brings a rare and valuable perspective that's grounded in the understanding of tech cultures and mindsets in both countries. Why isn't there much fear or caution around AI in China versus the US? Why are there so many robotic companies in China? And how has the investment landscape changed in recent years? With foreign capital largely replaced by RMB from municipal governments and state-owned enterprises. Let's hear Rui Ma's perspective. Welcome, Rui. You're definitely one of my favorite guests and speakers on anything China tech.
My name is Rui Ma. I'm the founder of TechBuzz China, which was started about 8 years ago as a passion project to explain China tech to the Western audience. I have a background in finance, graduated college over 20 years ago. Started my career in Silicon Valley and then had China for 8 years. That was from 2007 to 2015 and was very involved in all aspects of technology and finance. So started off in real estate investing, did a little media advisory and investing, and then went on to do early stage. So for TechBuzz China, we specialize in writing about China tech to investors and then connecting them now increasingly with experiences. So these experiences sometimes result in, these investor trips where I've been taking investors to meet some companies on the ground in China so they can test out for themselves what their theses are. And also we do some bespoke research and hopefully more stuff in the future. We've done some SPVs in the past where we invested into a few startups. I don't think that was the best market timing, and we'll see what we do with that in the future.
One of your recent trips we want to talk about is the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai. It's gotten a lot of attention for those who pay attention to AI and China tech. Can you just share what is it and why it's important?
Yeah, so it's basically a conference started by one specific district in Shanghai, the Xuhui government, and they have been really pushing for AI development the last 8 years. So if you're familiar with Shanghai, Shanghai has a bunch of different districts. Xuhui is one of the more centrally located, really well-resourced ones, but no one really links them to tech. But about a decade ago, the leadership decided that hey, we want to be part of this, tech revolution. And for whatever reason, they picked artificial intelligence, amongst other things. If you've asked the companies that are now, basically all of our meetings ended up being this one particular pocket of the district called Caohejing. So they really just dumped a lot of resources there and built a lot of new buildings, created a lot of, I assume, favorable policies for, like Tencent, Alibaba. Of course, the big companies established at least one of their, Shanghai headquarters there about 8 years ago. I think we were with Alibaba and they said this building didn't exist, the first World AI Conference. And then it was sort of built. And they remember going to the first World AI Conference and it was very small, right? So they were really impressed as well, looking at the evolution of the conference and just the development of AI in that specific district in China. How big was this, 8th iteration? It was attended by apparently 350,000 people. Again, they may be double counting visitors. It's called 人次, right? So it's just like visitors, maybe multiple people.
Maybe people went there on multiple.
Exactly, like we did. That's a lot of people. And it certainly it didn't feel overstated. If you were there in person like we were, it felt extremely crowded. There were just tons of attendees, tons of booths. It was super packed. I think impression even of the exhibitors was like, wow, we did not expect this either.
But who were the people that you brought to China and why were they interested in this conference?
People who already have an interest in China tech. Most people have some kind of investment perspective. So they are either venture capitalists or fund managers, private equity professionals, individual investors who are managing a sizable portfolio, or a few were entrepreneurs that were looking either interested in the ecosystem or looking for very specific opportunities to learn.
So what are your learnings from this trip? I mean, primarily the conference.
There are a bunch. I've written a lot about them on Twitter already. But the main one is that the concept of robotics is really intertwined with AI in China versus it's a little bit separated here. So embodied intelligence is really considered the same thing. In fact, a large part of the conference, I'd say at least 40%, was devoted to robotics. The other things are mentions of power that were talked about, the electricity generation, the concerns that Silicon Valley has over is it going to be enough electricity in the US to support all this AI demand. That's really not part of the conversation in China. Also, I would say cost concerns. I keep on saying the market reality is that the businesses are still not really willing to pay high prices for software. The economic conditions are also not great. So when people are making decisions about how to implement AI, they're very, very conscious of how much it's going to cost, resulting in the fact that it's very much everything is priced at 70% or more less expensive than comparable US products.
Why do you think there's so much focus on robotics over there? And as you said, it's much more integrated rather than here, it's like a separate conversation.
The very simple explanation is that China excels in manufacturing, and whatever business you're in, people are trying to tie it to manufacturing. That's just the strength. I'll give you an example of an AI company we met that started off doing media generation for high-end fashion, which is not at all related to manufacturing. But for the next iteration of their product, they're discovering that one thing they can do is to be more tightly integrated with manufacturers of textiles and home goods and use their secret sauce of creating digital assets and figuring out what trends on social media, etc., and work directly with the manufacturers to manufacture those products basically just in time. So as you see something trending on social media, imagine having that same design, motif, pattern, whatever it is, show up in some of your favorite products. It's just an example of how no matter what you're doing, everyone is trying to get closer and closer to manufacturing because it's so adjacent, right? It is, physically to where your industry is, and then also just the supply chain is so advanced there. It doesn't make sense not to take advantage of it.
How is that different here in Silicon Valley? And there's, talk about more emphasis on software here as well. And what is the difference between the hardware and the software emphasis?
I think it's just fundamentally different. The economies are so different. In the US, any kind of labor costs so much money. The main difference is that, so number one, China has a lot of the expertise to make some of these robotics, especially in the lower end. So a lot of the robots we're talking about are not necessarily
the
Tesla Optimus. It's primarily the manufacturing strength, and a lot of these things are not necessarily that fancy, right? So a lot of robots are actually like service robots, delivering your room service food. When people think of robots here, a lot of what they're making are very advanced industrial robots or super advanced humanoid robots, because those are like the only businesses I think that you could get funded for. Whereas in China, you are seeing that a lot of the companies that make autonomous pool cleaners, lawnmowers, these are companies that are able to get funding, surprisingly to me, because they have very healthy cash flow, but also because they're able to squeeze margin out of $100 to $300 or maybe up to $1,000 consumer electronics product. Even on the humanoid part, we've written about it at Tech China, is there's an overwhelming focus on making money and being able to be cash flow positive in the very near term, which means that people are making things that aren't trying to be Tesla Optimists and super advanced or the figure robots. They're making things that could cost $20,000, but could be used by someone in a school to do lab projects or at a tourism center to be a greeter. So they're not trying to jump to the sci-fi level per se, and they're just trying to replace the current need.
I have two questions. The first is about, we've seen many articles saying how China and the US are taking a different approach. China is much more interested in application, and then the US is much more interested in super intelligence getting to AGI. And it sounds like it's similar to what you just said. They're more interested in robotics that can be used by normal people. They're less interested, or maybe there's less money pouring into more advanced.
Absolutely, there is some difference. The incentives matter a lot. I'm not saying that China has no far out moonshot research projects. Obviously, there are. The research labs are doing really interesting things. But in terms of pressure to commercialize, in terms of valuations, you do see quite a big difference. I'll give you an example that we saw at a leading VC fund in China. I remember the slide when they presented it drew a big wow from the audience. They basically showed side by side two products that looked very similar. It was a driverless delivery robotic car. It looked like a big box on wheels. And the whole point is that this is fully autonomous. It's used for logistics. It's not used for long haul itineraries. It's used to go from small warehouse to big warehouse or even different parts of the warehouse. But the whole point is that it's totally autonomous and it's capable of carrying a good amount of weight. And on the left-hand side was the name of this US company that raised money and was once valued at $6 billion to do this thing and achieved $0 in revenue, because I don't think they ever really got beyond prototype stage before they ran out of money. And then on the right-hand side was something that, like I said, looked almost effectively the same, but is a Chinese company that this VC fund we were at had invested in, and they're valued at $600 million. And their Q2 revenue was 15 million USD. This was the narrative they're trying to say. Again, this is not the most frontier technology, but it involves integrating some fairly advanced tech. And not only are many Silicon Valley-based companies extremely expensive, but they are oftentimes unable to make the product when it comes to manufacturing it, especially at scale. And then I think is an underappreciated point. For many of these use cases, China is actually a better end market even, right? So you are much more likely to get someone like SF Express, which is a leading logistics provider in China, to use these because of the density of their operations and how much they need to relentlessly optimize, than to get someone like UPS here.
It's fascinating to hear that, because I'm on Xiaohongshu and TikTok. A lot of videos are about interesting robots in China. And as you said, they're not very advanced. A lot of them are just doing some basic labor work. But it's interesting to see there's so much and it's so utilized in people's daily life. To me, that's application. And so when you say you think there's going to be a bubble of robots in China, what do you mean by that? Is it just going to be over capacity, or there's something else that we haven't heard about?
Yeah, I feel like I need to give more context. When we say robots, it's ranging from industrial robotic arms to an automatic coffee maker to the humanoid robots that you're seeing people push out. What I mean by there is a bubble is that there is definitely a bubble right now in humanoid robots. And by bubble, I just mean the valuations have climbed much faster than visible technological advancement, right? So you take the same company, the same technology from even the beginning of the year to now, and that valuation has gone up a full order of magnitude without much having changed. Most of them are still in prototype stage. Whether or not you think it's justified depends on what you predict the future to be. It might be justified if you take a long enough time horizon. Personally, if I were an investor and I wanted to be in this space, then I would be kicking myself right now for not investing 6 months ago. versus now, right? And the other point you had about why are there so many robots running around? So most of the robots you're talking about are what I would call service robots, right? A very large amount of consumer electronics manufacturing is in China. Therefore, it's relatively easy for these consumer electronics brands to insert intelligence into something they already make, right? So, of course, there are startups that are brand new, but if you look at the background of these founders, a lot of them come from these other consumer electronics companies. And my understanding is that everyone has rebranded themselves as a robotics company. And you see things, marketing taken to an extreme. I'm not going to single out the name of the company, but there's this well-known AC manufacturer, air conditioning, and they recently announced that they inserted DeepSeek into their air conditioner. And it's like, wow, that's great. What is it actually doing? I guess I could talk to it and it could, I don't know, use weather predictions. Why did you even need to do that?
Isn't it the same in the US right now? You kind of have to use AI in front of every business? Or are you talking about it's kind of different over there?
Yeah, I guess it is similar. You get an AI premium for saying, for saying everything is AI, right? In reality, it's not that necessarily related to AI or whatever AI function you have in this product.
Sounds like people are very, in a way, like accept the idea that AI is in every part of your life. I wouldn't say the same in the US yet. It's more of a talk rather than experiencing it. Where, for example, there are a lot of questions here in the US about AI and there's a lot of fear. Do you feel the same in China?
Difficult to say it's proliferated much more in one market or another because it kind of depends on the population. My husband and I were marveling the other day that we live in the heart of Silicon Valley. We were going to a vinyl store to buy a record for a friend, and the owner, who was not that senior, maybe in their 50s, had never heard of ChatGPT. So it was actually insane. And I was like, you live maybe 5 miles away from Facebook. And there are definitely large swaths of the population for whom maybe they've heard of AI, but like their direct experience with it is very small, or even if they kind of interacted with it, like if they've seen an AI generated video, they may not even necessarily know. I've been asked this question and about US and China attitudes towards AI. Of course, there's some cultural, philosophical, due to religious beliefs, especially maybe some fears around intelligence that is too human-like. That is much less severe in a society that is very atheist like China. But I don't think that explains everything. I think it's multifactorial, and one of the things I think that isn't necessarily highlighted is just the fierce pace of change that Chinese society has gone through in the last 30 years, where you're effectively catching up on much more than 3 decades or 4 decades of development in a compressed timeline, making people much more open to change because they see every new generation of change has brought about some progress. So they're much more willing to take a chance on it and ask the question, how can I take advantage of this? How can I ride the wave versus being so fearful that the wave is going to overwhelm them and drown them?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think China over the last few decades, people are constantly thrown into a new situation with new tools and people don't even question. There's people here are much more resistant to changes that are coming at them. Comparing US and China in terms of attitude, whether it's more acceptance or more suspicion, is reflected in their regulations as well. China has the first AI regulations in the world, and according to some experts, they're much more about enabling AI development. And on the contrary, in the US, there's a lot of debate whether we should have AI regulations or not. Of course, we don't have anything right now. And when you think about regulations, it tends to be very sort of restrictive. Do you think in China, just in general, the government is very encouraging? I see lots of research institutions, they all set up AI institutions. It feels like the government is very encouraging.
I think that the Chinese government has a generally a techno-optimist attitude. I actually can't think of a single technology where they're like, oh, this absolutely can never be used at all. Even crypto, you have blockchain, right? So they're very pro-blockchain, anti the specific use of it in a currency situation. It's like the technology itself is somewhat neutral. It's really up to them to guide how it's being used in what they deem to be a productive, pro-social way. Now, not everyone is going to agree with what their decisions are, but that's sort of largely their philosophy. And I think this drive towards more fundamental research and science. China's always had a very robust, separate system from academia, right? Because they have these, like you said, this entire research arm, the academies, that was always very much prized, but infrastructure has been updated to try to become even more competitive. We'll see if it fully works, right? Because, the US has been a net absorber of top talent from China and many other nations in the past few decades. But I think China's trying to revamp its system to become more attractive.
Yeah, and it does produce a lot of top AI talents. I want to come back to the government attitude. One thing is to say we support it. The other is to actually pour in, resources and galvanizing private sector support. And the investors that you encounter in China, or those that are investing all these very interesting new developments, are they Chinese money, or are you still seeing foreign money coming in?
I see very little foreign money. This has been widely reported. If we're talking about the venture industries, that's been a lot replaced by local currency, including some municipal governments, state-owned enterprises. A lot of that funding was previously kind of locked up or severely restricted to be in these high-risk endeavors. And now that's opened up a lot relative to how it was like before. That being said, I don't think the two ways of investing are at all comparable. I'm largely familiar with the U.S. limited partners who have very long time horizons, very, very, very tolerant risk appetites, just have a lot of money, a lot of liquidity. For many of the Chinese limited partners, maybe they sound impressive on paper, this municipal government or that state-owned enterprise, but they have very different liquidity profiles from like a Yale endowment or a Texas teacher's pension, and they have very different access of products. So their terms are very different, and therefore the projects they fund, because their risk appetite, right, their expected return profile, their aims and ends are different, and they're actually a lot more onerous, I would say, which does lead to some entrepreneurs being very unhappy, right? And lots of venture capitalists who are trying to raise money from said institutions are also complaining. It's just a different game. You're really dealing with an entirely different financial ecosystem, right? Their Chinese capital markets are also different. Exit avenues are different.
Comparing now to maybe 10, 15 years ago, when there's the internet boom in China, so much foreign money poured in, really helping develop the tech sector. But now it seems like it's no longer the case. So where do people raise their private capital? And are you still seeing a lot of returnees, meaning Chinese, graduate students who, after graduation in the U.S., stay in the U.S. for a couple of years, went back to China to start companies? Are these things still happening, or it's a totally different game now?
Well, as far as I understand, many LPs have not explicitly pulled out of China, but have taken a pause. Those tend to be US-based LPs, but those tend to be a lot of the larger institutions. You have, smaller LPs, family money, that are a bit more flexible, where they deploy. They just have longer time horizons. They have different risk profiles. And then, of course, you have other geographies who all have some amount of US dollars, right? Some geographies have quite a lot, like the Middle East. Everyone's fundraising there, including Silicon Valley. So there are still some funds that are pursuing what I would call a sole USD strategy, but most funds I know have increasingly relied on their RMB fundraising, which is, like I said before, from locally based institutions, individuals, because it is China and the governments do actually have money, unlike the municipal governments here. So they do participate in high-tech investing. It's not usually the government directly. It's usually some program that's managed by a professional manager that is then making capital allocation decisions.
You certainly don't see that, or you haven't seen that in the US yet. So it feels like China is much more at the government level strategic about how they want to integrate AI's development into their national economic development or technology development. Do you think because they think having the AI leadership is very important? Like in the US, obviously, I think Washington, D.C., the White House also sees.
No, I actually don't hear at all the same sort of existential winner take all, like we must be first to AGI and then reach the singularity and then that's all over. That rarely comes up. You do see some people talk about it, but inevitably it's traced to then quoting some Western voice. Natively, there isn't that much concern about that. It's more like AI is a technology. It seems really powerful. It's going to transform the world. You got to get on top of it. There's not a sense of we gotta be the first to a finish line.
Yeah.
Because the finish line is very amorphous. What is this finish line? In the US, I feel like there's the Skynet moment, right? Where the consciousness goes sentient and then takes over all the hardware and then becomes undestroyable and it becomes the sole destroyer of everything. That possibility doesn't really get talked about. And possibly it's because, movies like that obviously did make it all over the world and people do know of it in China, but it hasn't caught on fire like everyone's imagination.
Everyone said this. Chinese are so practical. They're just more interested in how does this affect my daily routine. So some bigger idea of how this is going to be live or death kind of situation between US and China. I don't think most people really buy into that over there. Most people probably don't here either. It's just a smaller number of people who control a lot of power. Since in the US, people sitting in Washington, D.C. in particular have that national security lens towards this AI competition with China. So policies, including export controls, weave into almost every conversation here in Washington, D.C. when it comes to AI. If it's not happening in China, do you think that's really affecting them and their development? For example, chips control definitely have an impact on them, right? Is it just that people don't talk about it?
I'm sure in certain circles, I'm just not privy to them. It is being discussed on a national security or maybe weapons or defense level much more. I primarily talk to your everyday software entrepreneurs, people making cooking robots, maintenance robots, so that does not come up. And in the way of chip restrictions, that does definitely come up in conversation, but it's not really something that most people can do anything about. So it's rarely discussed from necessarily like, I'm concerned about this because I care so much about national security. First of all, there are only very few companies where you're really directly working on the chip level. If you're an application, you don't care. You're waiting for the models themselves to become more efficient, and you're focused on optimizing your own engineering. You don't really care what NVIDIA does. For the chips, a lot of it is just driven by practical realities. If you do have to deal with chips, then you care about Chinese customers are not very generous. They don't have a very high willingness to pay. That impacts the infrastructure that you can build on to make your entire business economical. Of course, this is tech, so everyone understands that initially you might have to lose money to get some customers. But you lose money on the marketing piece, right? Everyone can understand that. You don't lose money on just COGS in general. You don't have negative gross margin and hope that's a business, right? And if you are willing to do that, you're only going to do that for a very brief amount of time because you have very high confidence it's going to turn positive. Local indigenous industry has definitely been accelerated by all these sanctions. It's great when you're competitors taken out of the market entirely, but they were always going to have to figure out alternatives anyway, because I don't think NVIDIA is incentivized in the same way as local chip makers to make these rumored DeepSeek optimizations. I just don't think they would have necessarily gone that route. Or if they did, they probably wouldn't have been the most proactive about it because they don't need to. They're a $4 trillion company and there's plenty of demand for all their other really, really high-end stuff. Why do you need to service the low-end Chinese market who's like selling to customers paying RMB cents per month?
So Tom Friedman had an opinion piece about the imminent danger of AI will eventually force US and China to work together It's a really interesting argument. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Because essentially, he's saying the challenge of AI is so great to humanity that the two countries, the leading countries, obviously, will have to work together. Otherwise, humans wouldn't know what to do with it. It's different from the current narrative, which is because of the need to be an AI leader, so the two countries are competing each other fiercely. And from what you saw in China, what do you think?
I don't know. That's kind of a weird headline to me because we have some other really real existential risks like global pandemics, climate change, and that hasn't made anyone who does not want to work together. So I'm not really convinced that AI will be that magic bullet.
You're about to take on another trip to China. Is it also with investors to learn more about the AI field?
It's with the group that came to me, so it's a little bit curated for their needs. It's a mixture of VCs and entrepreneurs, and they are just interested in seeing so-called deep tech in China. So it's broader than AI. We're gonna visit like autonomous driving, flying taxis, those are called EV tolls, and then an EV factory. We're gonna visit the NEO factory in Hefei. We're gonna talk to a quantum company, a brain computer interface company, humanoid robotics company. These companies are all very early. They're all pre-Series B, except for the bigger AI companies that we're going to. And the idea is to get a sense of the ecosystem. How mature really are these companies? We're very lucky to be visiting some of the more well-capitalized and at least more well-known in these respective sectors. The flying taxi company, they told us they would give us 2 slots to do a test flight. So I'll have to lottery that off somehow to be fair to everyone in the group. Everyone wants to try.
It's fascinating for you to get on those trips, I'm sure. And what's most exciting to you? Let's say in the next 12 months, what do you see that's coming up in China that will shock the world?
I feel like China tech's been consistently shocking the world. The cop-out answer I give is I think China will come out with some really interesting biotech innovations, and it already has a lot of very interesting energy innovations. Biotech is still a little under the radar because I think the results are more binary. It's like you either discovered this drug or you didn't. Whereas with, many of these other things, like you can kind of show prototypes along the way and have some wow factor, especially if it's a well choreographed prototype, right? A demo. And that's probably where I think people would be a little bit shocked who haven't been following along. But if you've been following along, nothing would shock you. I saw the other day that there's been some progress made on alternative materials for semiconductors. That, by the way, people have been trying to do that for years and years and years. And someone somewhere was going to make some progress. So this company had to be from China because in the US we don't fund companies like that. So this founder was actually educated in the US, came from China but educated in the US, and tried really hard to get funding here, could not, and then went to China. That's where you're going to see quote unquote surprises, because those people have been consistently working on whatever breakthrough they were trying to achieve for the last decade, and sometimes decade plus. China was the only place that was willing to give them money for some of this fundamental research. And a small amount of those people are going to have really interesting achievements, and we're going to find it surprising. But if you trace back, it's like, hey, the seeds were planted really long time ago.
As is the case in most of their sectors, we're just now finally seeing their results. So with that, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us. It's always so much learning after talking to you. Driven by China's manufacturing capabilities, robotics is deeply integrated with AI in China. Instead of focusing on advanced sci-fi level projects like the Tesla Optimus, many companies are creating simple practical service robots for tasks such as food delivery or pool cleaning, with a strong emphasis on commercialization and achieving positive cash flow. Characterized as techno-optimism, China generally takes a neutral to encouraging attitude toward AI development. Unlike the US, there's less fear surrounding AI's potential dangers, and the rapid pace of change in Chinese society has made people more willing to embrace new technology. These differences in philosophy and capability are certainly setting China and the US on divergent paths for AI advancement. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.